Hi, hello, it's me again, and this is the fourth chapter of his leading light, named Two Idols in One Day. Summary: Izuku hanging on a rooftop contemplating life, as well as other stuff. Izuku could feel his head hurt, though he wasn't sure if it had been from how hard he's had to work to be able to hear the hero's last words, or if it was from the feeling of hopelessness and grief that had seemed to make his heart hammer loudly and his chest ache, as his eyes seemed to be unable to focus on anything. His knees buckled, having fought hard to stay standing ever since he had first heard the hero's ever-echoing no. He hadn't wanted the symbol of peace to see how weak and pathetic he was. Not that it really mattered anyways. All Might had thought he was weak the second he knew he was quirkless. Izuku hadn't missed the way the hero kept looking back at his shoes whenever he mentioned anything to do with strength or power. A pitiful and almost understanding look on his face whenever he did. Except it was the kind of understanding look someone would give you if they thought they knew what they were talking about. It felt condescending. It felt like how someone would look at a hurt animal knowing the poor thing wouldn't be able to help itself, but also knowing they couldn't or wouldn't do anything to help it themselves. How was All Might supposed to know what Izuku had gone through? How was he supposed to understand? Izuku had everything he wanted, and then he had it all ripped away, torn to shreds, and all for a reason that wasn't even true. Midori Izuku wasn't quirkless, isn't quirkless, he has a quirk. But even then, it was useless, because he couldn't even do what his quirk wanted him to. Even now, his quirk was tugging at him increasingly to move, begging him to go to the door All Might had just exited and get down from the roof. And yet, Izuku wasn't sure if he would be able to move if he hadn't somehow managed to muster up enough energy and willpower to try. Izuku felt dizzy as he looked at the sky on the horizon, looking through the bars of the roof railing and over the city's many rooftops. The sun was still shining brightly, warm, just as it had been just a few hours earlier when he picked up his notebook from the koi pond just outside the classroom. The koi pond captain had thrown his notebook in right before telling him to take a swan dive off a roof. That's funny, isn't it? Ironic that All Might told him he couldn't be a hero without a quirk and left him on the rooftop just hours after Izuku was told to jump off a rooftop to have a second chance at getting a quirk to become a hero in his next life. It was almost as if fate herself was setting this all up just for him, telling him to jump, that she was willing to give him a new chance. He could exchange one life for another. He just had to give up the first one first. It's not like anyone would miss him. Not like anyone would care. When he had thought about it before, he had thought it would ruin Kachan's chances of becoming a hero, but who was he kidding? Quirkless suicides were more common than not, at least on paper. Quirkless discrimination was so bad in the police force that most cases involving quirkless disappearances were just automatically labeled as suicide, and then that was it. So even if the police got involved, they wouldn't care enough about him to look into why he would have been driven to take his life in the first place. And to think All Might had told him to join them. The police weren't allowed to use their quirks on the job. That's the whole reason heroes existed in the first place, as a way to fight quirk criminals without allowing the police to use their quirks. Because For some reason, the public had always been against giving the police, and thereby the government, more power, too afraid of hidden agendas. Even though heroes are probably being controlled more than the police. The Hero Public Safety Commission have a lot more hidden agendas and a lot more corruption than the government. Yet the police followed the same discrimination as everybody else. And the medical field even more so. You would have to be the best doctor in the world to be even allowed to intern as a nurse in a hospital if you couldn't prove that your work could be at least somehow useful in the field. And in the same twisted way, if you had a quirk that had an obvious medical value, you'd practically be forced into the field, given little to no choice regarding your own life. He wonders what kind of life All Might must have had growing up with the perfect quirk. It's no longer his views are so rose-tinted. The hero didn't really seem like he knew anything about anything. He recognized Izuku's shoes, so he must know about the inherent discrimination behind them, right? And yet he didn't realize that leaving a quirkless kid alone on a rooftop after crushing his dreams was a relatively bad idea? Did he think all quirkless people had just collectively decided that their favorite color was red and called it a day? Or did he just not care enough to sit down and actually think about it? Did All Might just not care? Or was he maybe just that stupid? He had told Izuku to let go of him while flying a half kilometer up in the air, and not only that, but he also began pushing Izuku off of him too. Izuku could have been literally killed by All Might. He would probably have been killed by All Might had he hesitated just a few more seconds in telling the hero that he would literally die if he let go. Had he not been clinging to All Might's leg as tight as he had been, the hero would have just succeeded in pushing him off. Izuku had studied All Might, analyzed his quirk and posture and fighting style enough, watched enough videos and surveillance footage of the hero to know for sure how fast All Might would have been able to turn midair, to stoop down and catch someone falling. He knows that All Might would have caught him before the landing could have killed him had he been in his normal shape. Izuku also knows now that All Might was out of time, that the chances of all those moves taking him an extra half second to do were high, and that the chances of those extra seconds being the difference between Izuku's life and death were even higher. Izuku could have very easily died right there and then. And yet, thinking about it now, the only thing Izuku can think about is how it would affect All Might. Would the media or the police hear of it first? Well, that really depends on where he would have landed. Izuku managed to turn his head enough to look over where they came from, trying to calculate where he would have landed, only to find out that it mostly stood between a pretty busy street and the top of a pretty high building. So it really could go either way. If he had landed in the streets, the media would most likely go one of two ways, most depending on the different media outlets' history of All Might as a hero and what reporters and journalists are given the case. If the outlets have a history of painting the hero in glory, as most media does, the incident would most likely be covered up. No one wants to hear about All Might killing a kid when the reason the hero is so popular and sells so much is because of how much they admire him. Though some, especially those who are more hero neutral, though those are very hard to find. as well as those deciding to utilize the reporters and journalists who take risks and have a good way with words, might decide to give the very much clickbait-worthy title of Symbol of Peel's Kills Defenseless Child a chance. It would have been a huge risk though, because while yes, people would click on that immediately the second they decided to not care or to not believe it, or that everybody makes mistakes. Just look at Endeavor, which let's just not bring him into this as well. The media would immediately be stapled as anti-All Might, anti-number one hero, anti-symbol of peace, and thus anti-peace. Not to mention that most people just wouldn't care that the kid was dead the second they found out he was quirkless. But no matter what happened, the media would still attack it from all angles. And All Might would have had to face it in the upcoming interviews and news articles, and his PR team would have to deal heavily with the fact that All Might so advertised 100 success rate would have been very publicly tarnished. However, had he landed on a roof, no one would have noticed. Heroes and villains fly over people's heads all of the time, so much so that unless they see the telltale red sign of red wings signalizing that it's hot, or All Might's colorful costume, no one really bothers to look up every time anymore. So no one below would notice it, and All Might would have most likely called a friend in the police force, because really, what are the odds the number one crime-fighting hero in the world doesn't have at least one personal friend who works in the police force? Once the police arrived, they would probably just take one look at his shoes and cover the whole thing up by calling it a suicide, and no one would care to question it. His injuries would have matched up to what he would have had he actually jumped off a building, and so even if his mom had cared enough to question it, she wouldn't have had any reason to. He wonders how she would have reacted. Would she have cared? Would she have even noticed? The two of them hadn't really talked for about a month now, and even before then it had just been simple hellos and goodbyes. Did she even know he was there? The only reason Izuku even knew that his mom still came home was that he often sat up late in his room writing and analyzing until past midnight on days he couldn't sleep. And even then all he could hear was the door suddenly open and shut at the entrance. The door had gradually gotten quieter over the years, probably because she got tired of slamming it shut behind her every night. Maybe she got some noise complaints from the neighbors. Although they hadn't really bothered them since they learned she had a quirkless son, always looking at her with pity, and at him in disgust. He was pretty sure his mom would have noticed him being gone unless he came home while she was still there and awake. Or would she? Would she notice the absence of alarm red shoes at the door? The absence of a low, constant muttering that he used to think travelled loudly throughout the thin walls in the house? The absence of a low, constant muttering that he used to think travelled loudly through the thin walls in the house. Managing to sit up slightly, still leaning heavily on his arms for support, Izuku looked over the horizon again, seeing the sun lower than before, a faraway thought, wondering, what time is it? How long he's been laying here? He doesn't have the energy to check his phone. His gaze started going from the sky down, following over the rooftops until it eventually landed on the edge of the rooftop he was sitting on now. He could do it, right? I mean, there is literally no reason he shouldn't. His damned unevolved pinky toes will always be an indicator to people who have to live with the label of being quirkless. He will always be an inept, genderless, unevolved, and null. He will always be seen just as a useless deco. He has a quirk, but he has no way to prove it, and he's willing to bet that even if he found a way to prove it, no one would believe it. They just find excuses. Say he could prove it by going into a pitch black room and locating something using his light. But first he would have to find someone who would let him talk without being immediately ignored. Then, second, he would have to convince them to let him try, and find a way to avoid being beaten just for still lying, or making stuff up for attention, or not accepting reality yet. Third, if he had managed to get that far, he would have to find a way to make it impossible to doubt what he did, meaning he can't be the one to choose the room or even have seen the room beforehand, because then they would argue that he just knew where the thing was from the beginning. It also can't be something with a recognizable shape, because then they would say he felt for it. And he can't be the one to choose what in the room he's supposed to locate, because he can't know what's in the room to begin with. And if Izuku can't choose the object, then he can't make sure it's not something that would be recognizable by shape. And so it's honestly just not going to work, because everyone in Izuku's lives are so obsessed with the fact that he's quirkless that they would just come up with literally anything to disprove otherwise. It's psychology. People hate being proven wrong, and especially by someone they already see as being beneath themselves. So, Izuku can prove that he has a quirk, and no one will ever want to believe him. No one will ever want to believe in him. Hell, even All Might, whose sole job is literally to motivate and inspire and bring hope to the young, who always says that he believes in the next generation, doesn't believe in him. The number one hero doesn't believe he has any chance at becoming a hero, doesn't believe he should be a hero. And if anyone should know who has or who doesn't have potential, it should be the number one hero, right? Izuku doesn't know when he stood up, nor does he know when he started walking towards the edge, but looking down, holding the railing to make sure he doesn't fall with how weak his legs still feel, there are people there. It can be too late then. Izuku doesn't recognize this part of town, but it doesn't look like a place that would be crowded in the evening. There is a child walking with their parents down on the other side of the road. He will wait. There is no reason for him to traumatize a child like that. It's not like he doesn't have time to wait either. As if his mother is going to come home early and actually check on him instead of going straight to bed. No. Unless the police called her, she probably wouldn't notice he was dead until the school would have called her to say that her son hadn't been to school in a while. That is, if they even care to do that much. Well, they might if they thought it would give him trouble at home. Izuku turned towards the rest of the roof. He was going to sit down, to lean against the railing, when he saw his notebook lying in the middle of the roof. It's honestly a miracle he hadn't lost it in the jump, as he was just holding it in his hand. It must have been held between his arm and All Might's leg. That makes sense. Izuku moves over to pick it up, then goes back to the railing and sits down. Oh, that's right, he's still wearing his backpack. He completely forgot about it. He'd been laying on his side, so he didn't notice. At least he should have a pen or something in the backpack. That way he'd have something to do while waiting for the streets below to empty. Taking off his backpack, Izuku sat himself against the railing more comfortably before fishing out a pen and opening his notebook. Izuku had his notebook open in his lap on what was supposed to be the next page, but it wasn't blank. He was going to start on the second page, as he usually did, as he always left a blank page after every new analysis just in case he found out something new he needed to write down. But filling up both the spare pages for the new hero mount lady who had just debuted and what he thought would be the first page of a new updated analysis of Hawks, who he hadn't really written a full analysis on since he debuted, was now a big autograph of All Might. Had Izuku seen this when he first woke up from the villain's attack, he would have been ecstatic. He wouldn't have cared about Mount's Lady Lost page, and he would have probably sacrificed her second page on the back too, to be able to take out the 2 pages to frame the autograph in his room. It was his school notebook anyway, and he already had the organized, updated version in his room at home. But looking at the autograph now, Izuku felt something else. Something he wasn't sure what to call. He was definitely not happy. He didn't like it. But he didn't want to call it anger either. Though whenever that came from him actually not being mad, or just not wanting to admit that he was mad at his number one hero, Izuku couldn't really tell. But either way, All Might had gone to the next page in his notebook. Not the last page, the next page. Meaning he had to have seen at least some of the contents of the notebook. Had to have seen what it was about. It was really how to miss, considering the title was Hero Analysis for the Future, and every page had at least one sketch of either a hero or the support item, some more detailed than the others, but all of them were recognizable. All Might had seen them. Or he had to at least have seen some of that, all the work Izuku had done in an attempt to level the field, to learn, and he still didn't believe Izuku had a chance. Well, it's not like it should actually come as a surprise. No one else had ever believed in him, so why would All Might be any different? Izuku knows that heroism is one of the main reasons quirk discrimination is as bad as it is today. Heroism pushed the most heroic quirks onto a pedestal, and then started to hate the villainous quirks as a result. Mutant quirks are hated for being different and ugly, unless you're really lucky and get a quirk like Hawks that's considered human enough to be okay. While weak quirks are seen as useless and a waste because it's all seen in the comparison to heroism, and if the quirk doesn't have an obvious use in the heroism, then it has to be weak. Though at least they have a quirk, at least they're still evolved, still a part of the quirk, the new humanity. The quirkiest teachers, at least at Aldera, loved to compare the quirkless with the Neanderthals that had lived tens of thousands of years ago. They were less evolved, and since the quirkless are also less evolved, they must share more traits, right? It's honestly dumb how little we learn about the pre-quirk era in history, considering that quirkless people had lived just fine and survived life on Earth for 2 million years. And according to the internet, we have recorded history of societies from over 6,000 years ago. Yet we almost exclusively learn about the past centuries in school because that's the most important, because that's when quirks started appearing. The only reason Izuku even knows this is because he searched it up himself. But the fact that the only things they learn about the pre-quirk era are Japanese traditions and culture because that's deemed most important, and even then the teachers avoid the word quirkless by any means while teaching. It's actually hurtful to society because his history repeats itself if you don't learn from it. And if you don't learn about it, it definitely will. Because then we don't learn what not to do in the future. As Izuku sat and thought through the basis of quirk discrimination and the obvious bad influences it had on the society, time went by, and when he at last came out of his thoughts, the sky had gone dark, and he couldn't hear any noise from below. Putting the notebook, which had been laying open on his lap, showcasing All Might's autograph the whole time, into his backpack, he stood up again, and looking over the edge that the street was empty. Izuku took a deep breath as he looked again over the rooftops. It was actually a really pretty night, not a cloud in the sky, making all the light coming from in between the tall buildings seem even brighter in the contrast to the almost black blue of the sky. He took off his shoes and made sure to place them nice and orderly beside his backpack that was now leaning against the railing. Without further ado, Izuku started climbing over the railing until he was standing with his back against it and the rest of the roof, his arms holding the railing behind him tightly as his feet balanced on the 15 centimeters of roof that went beyond the railing before it went straight down. 7 stories. The thought of Kachan made its way back into his mind as he stood there, wondering what his former best friend would think of him now, wondering if he'd be happy, wondering if, when the news of his death reached the classroom, maybe his teachers would call for a celebration, maybe there would be cake. How ironic the thought that this would be the end of the red spider lilies, because no one would actually care to put morning flowers on his desk when he was actually dead. Then it would seem as if they actually cared, and didn't just do it to get to this point. Auntie and uncle might care, but he hasn't really seen them that often in a while, so maybe not. Mom had always been keeping in contact with them, at least he thinks so, considering she's almost never home on weekends either. If they've talked about him, then Auntie and Uncle probably don't think of him that highly anymore anyways, so he doesn't have to worry about that. Izuku had heard that when you die, your whole life flashes before your eyes, but he isn't dying yet. He hasn't jumped, so why is he doing that now? And shouldn't he be thinking about good things when he dies? Does he have any good things to think about? Usually, the good thing to think about would be heroes and All Might, but he doesn't really want to think about All Might right now. He could think about other heroes, like that one underground hero that he's been watching on the surveillance cameras on those nights when he couldn't sleep and wanted to analyze. Honestly, the underground heroes are so cool, and this one in particular has to be one of the best out there. And the best part is his quirk. Izuku found out about the hero when he was 12, so very quickly after he started hacking into the cameras. And since he didn't have a name, his 12-year-old self just went on Google to search up synonyms for cancel to find out what to call him. He would have just called him cancel, but he didn't think that sounded cool enough, so he ended up finding the synonym nix. So nix it is. To be completely honest, his first option would have been nullify, because it just fit him so well. Nullify literally meaning take away, but because null is a slur, another word for quirkless, it would also mean turn quirkless, which is literally what his quirk does, but calling a hero a slur seemed really disrespectful, and Izuku really didn't want to be disrespectful to the underground hero, especially because Izuku had never seen the hero discriminate on the job. But he also didn't want to just get rid of a name that fit just so well, and so, considering no one ever read his notes anyway, it was always just for him to have a name until he maybe eventually found out the real name. Not that it was going to happen now. Izuku had ended up putting it down as the hero's quirk name. Every time Izuku had watched Nyx, the hero had never hesitated to save anyone due to quirk status. Izuku had seen him jump in and save mutation quirked people without a second thought, which really shouldn't be a surprising or impressive thing, but considering how many heroes, Limelight, Twilight, and Underground alike, often hesitated with mutation quirks because they wanted to make sure who was actually the victim here, even though it was usually pretty obvious from one look alone. The fact that Nyx didn't just put him even higher on Izuku's list, though not discriminating against mutations and not discriminating against the quirkless are two very different things, so he couldn't say for sure that Nyx wouldn't hate him if they were ever meet. Izuku looked down again. Maybe the good thing to think about now was that he would be helping people this way. He would be sparing others from being uncomfortable around him, sparing his mother from the burden of having him, and sparing people from having to see him. So, in a way, jumping would be his way of helping, right? Right. Okay. Izuku took a deep breath again, feeling the cold, biting night air send a light breeze as if pushing him towards the edge, feeling the way his feet ached from standing only on his heels for so long, feeling the way his lungs and throat somehow still burned from the abuse and lingering slime still in him. He definitely should have seen a doctor, but that didn't really matter when he wouldn't be alive much longer anyways. Feeling how his arms ache for how tightly he's been clutching the railing. Feeling the constant tug from his light that seemed to slowly grow stronger, wanting to lead him to the escape door. Wait? Isn't the escape door on his right? Why would the light want him to go to the left? Would his quirk prefer if he died on another side of this building? Is that it? Following his now growing curiosity, Izuku looks towards the way his light wants him to go. There's someone there. On a rooftop 4 roofs away, and they seem to be getting closer. They keep to the shadow of the rooftop so Izuku can see much of their silhouette, but he's got a feeling it's an underground hero, as they would have at the earliest started working an hour ago. But who was this? Izuku still wasn't completely sure where in Musutaf he currently was, and so he wasn't sure who it could be, but if they were an underground hero, they would probably try to stop him. That is, until they see his red shoes. Maybe he should just jump before the hero got there. But if they see it happen, that would ruin the whole his jump not affecting anyone badly thing. Especially if he let them see him jump while thinking he was a quirked individual. Looking down at the streets again, he saw a group of teenagers rounding the corner. Yeah, no. He couldn't jump now. He spent too much time. Izuku carefully crawled back over the railing and sat back down beside his backpack and shoes again. He took out his notebook and turned to the page after All Might's obnoxious signature. Even if the hero approaching just saw him not jumping and thought their job was done, they should still be close enough for Izuku to send his light over and see them more clearly. And then he could figure out who it is. So that's what he did. He looked up towards where the hero was approaching, where his light still really wanted him to go. He just looked in the time to see the hero jump onto his roof, and wow, that was quick. And silent. Izuku was pretty sure that if he hadn't known the hero was coming, he still wouldn't know he was there, given how silent and dark it was. He sent his light to illuminate the hero, only for his body to freeze when it had gotten halfway, barely close enough to the outline of the white scarf as the only non-black article on him, except his yellow goggles and the darkly grey utility belt that Izuku knew he was wearing despite not being able to see it either, just because the goggles were being hidden in the scarf. Izuku was looking at Nyx. But how was that possible? Nyx wasn't supposed to start patrol this early today. It's the third day of the 4-day patrol route that the hero used in order to make his route less predictable. And though Izuku wasn't sure where he was himself, he was sure that this wasn't the part of the hero's usual route. If only because then he would have been able to recognize where he was before. Izuku, completely forgetting everything he had been about to do that evening, was stuck staring at the hero, his idol, like a wide-eyed idiot, as he got stuck in the thoughts of, how and why are you here? Along with a few, does this universe feel pity for me or hate me, as to send my second favorite hero to me right after my first favorite hero crushed me completely? And that's it for chapter 4. As usual, thank you for listening, and sorry if my voice was a little off today. I was reading before, and I don't know if it turned out any good. But anyway, thanks for listening, and have a great day, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.